Well, welcome to the 9th session of the Old Testament survey, where we are going to transition away from the historical literature of the Old Testament and the intertestamental period and move into the two remaining sections of literature within the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to begin our time with the prophetical literature. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is the prophetical literature? What is this area of Scripture? Well, this section of Scripture contains both the major and the minor prophets, who spoke, well, prophecy. And prophets could and would speak of events to come. Prophetical literature contained not just prophecy, though. It contained narrative or historical accounts. We see that, for example, in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Jonah will all give some form of history in their writing. And so while each of these books and the other ones are part of the prophetical genre of the Old Testament, there is also narrative within those. And you will see that again, as I mentioned in those texts above. Now, naturally, a question that occurs at this point is, what is the role of a prophet? The role of a prophet was to remind God's people to stay faithful to the covenant promise that He made to His people at Mount Sinai. You might recall me saying throughout this series that to remember the marriage vows that they made at Mount Sinai with God. And so where God says, I will be faithful to you, I need you to be faithful to me. And so it is not like these guys were fortune tellers. Okay? Their job was to ensure that the nation would stay committed to God. And so they would continually remind them of God's covenant with His people and His covenant promises. In addition, He would remind them, remember, you are to be priests to the world. That was God's intent, if you remember back in Exodus chapter 19, where He told His people, I want you to be a light, to be priests to the world. And so with that, a prophet would also continue to encourage the people to stay faithful. And as I said once again, a prophet was not a fortune teller, but one who did prophesy what would occur for covenant faithfulness or for covenant unfaithfulness. Now, there is division within the prophets. There are the major prophets, and these are prophets who wrote longer books. This doesn't mean that their message was somehow more important than the others. These major prophets would be Isaiah and Jeremiah, which includes the book of Lamentations, because again, Jeremiah is writing that as he's seeing Jerusalem be destroyed, he is lamenting the fall. We also have Ezekiel in the major prophets, Daniel as well. There are also the minor prophets who wrote shorter books. This is also known as the Book of the 12. And so Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi all factor in, or all are a part of this Book of the 12 or minor prophets. Now, it's important to understand too that there were other prophets. Just because someone was a prophet doesn't mean that they would write a book. In fact, the Old Testament is full of prophets because there were other prophets that Yahweh wanted to communicate to His people through, but they received little or no mention. And so some of these would be Elijah and Elisha, who were non-writing prophets. Moses was considered the prototypical prophet, as we see in Deuteronomy 18, 15 to 22, because he speaks for God. And in each succeeding prophet was validated some aspect of their life and some part of their ministry by its similarity to that of Moses. For example, if you look at Jeremiah 1:6 or Amos 7, 14 to 15, where again, they are showing that they have those aspects in the same way that Moses did. Samuel also functioned as a prophet, as well as a judge and a priest. He had multiple roles or multiple hats. There is also what's known as the prophetic guild, or some of your texts might read, the sons of the prophets. We see this show up and in reference in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 38. And so these prophets themselves were a group of prophets. There are also unnamed prophets at various times in Israel's history. We also sadly know there were plenty of false prophets, such as Zedekiah, who occurs in 1 Kings chapter 22, or Hananiah, who is revealed in Jeremiah chapter 28. And these are prophets who believed they were speaking for God, but in fact, they led the people away from covenant faithfulness and incorrectly advised the kings as to what to do. False prophets among the Israelites often functions more as cheerleaders for the king's empirical plans, such as we see Zedekiah in 1 Kings 22, than they did for actually confronting people, like what Elijah and Elisha and others did. Now, there were also prophets within this who had a different focus. They would either focus maybe on the northern kingdom. So again, we had the northern kingdom with the 10 tribes, and then the southern kingdom in the south. So here are your prophets to the northern kingdom, at least in the sense that ones that either wrote books such as Amos, Hosea, and Nahum, but also Elijah and Elisha were also prophets to the north. And we talked about them in our lecture over the kingdom period. There are also prophets to the southern kingdom. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Joel, Obadiah, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah show up during this time. In fact, Obadiah specifically was ministering to the Edomites. You also had the exilic prophets, Ezekiel and Daniel. They're prophets during the exile. And then finally, there's prophets to Assyria. For example, you have Jonah, who directly goes into Nineveh, an Assyrian city, but also Nahum, who does so indirectly. As I mentioned before, Obadiah did prophesy to the Edomites, and these incidentally were the descendants of Esau, who took advantage of Israel when they were weak and vulnerable. In conclusion, there were post-exilic prophets. Okay, so after the exile, and Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi filled these roles. Now, as we talk into this, it is important to understand prophetic language, because the prophets were known for using harsh, vivid, and offensive language to move the people to listen. And the reason this method was used was it resulted from Israel's stubbornness and refusal to listen to previous prophets. In other words, their method is not God's normal modus operandi or normal MO. In fact, it's the mode that God has to use because He has been gentle. He has been patient with them, and they're not listening to that. And so as a result, He has to turn up the volume. This is why someone like a Martin Luther King Jr. and the way in which he would push people to re-examine things. Now, his language would not be near as colorful as the language, or near as graphic as the language of these prophets. But nonetheless, it was that similar role of something maybe closer to our own time, where we can look and see someone who had a prophetic use and a prophetic mode. And also, it's important to understand that the prophet's messages were usually very emotionally and colorfully expressed from the visceral experiences of both the present condition and also the future hope that expressed to the nations. And this is somewhat similar or akin to Paul's heartfelt pleas in Romans 6 to 7 and chapters 9 to 10. Another thing, too, to understand about prophetic language is that the majority of prophetic literature is full of strong language, calling the people of God to repent of their sinful behavior and promising destruction for those who do not. So the cry of Yahweh through the prophet was a plea to return to Yahweh. Come back and be faithful. Come back to the marriage vows in a loving and covenantal faithfulness, as mentioned previously. And the hope there as well is that within it there would be blessing, salvation, and vindication of the Lord. And we see this in Isaiah 60 to 66. Yet there is always at least one or more messages of grace where God promises restoration and blessing to those who follow Him. This is often the part that frankly is forgotten by people, because we read these prophets or we just see the way, we see their graphic language as we look through it. But we don't see that buried or very clear within each prophetical message is where God is wooing His people back and He's promising restoration, because He though they may give up on him, he will not give up on them. There are two major key themes that we could focus on for this. Again, because of the length of this session, we can't go into many more, but I thought I'd hit two. The first of these is the idea of the Messiah, or the Anointed One, the Mashiach. And we see the fulfillment of this is the Davidic covenant that God gave in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is what the Messiah was. This is why Jesus had to come from the line of Judah. Why? Because David came from the line of Judah. And so these prophets will speak of this Messiah who will not only restore Israel, but make her great in the world once again. Just as in Solomon's day. You might recall that as we talked about the intertestamental period, how they were looking for a Messiah. Maybe it's Judas Maccabeus. Maybe it was another one of the Hasmoneans. And how they're trying to be restored back to the grand days of old. And so this offered hope to the faithful who were dealing with the adversity around them, whether pre-exile or during the exile or even post-exile. In addition, there would be a renewed and faithful heart within Israel whenever the Messiah comes. And so the prophets speak of a day when Israel will be faithful to God and His covenant. Jeremiah speaks of this specifically in Jeremiah 31 to 34, where he says that God will write these things on the tablet, no longer tablets of stone, but the tablets of your heart. And so Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 speak of a new covenant and a renewed relationship initiated by God through the Spirit. In other words, where the kingdom of God invades the earth in Christ. A new beginning of God's dream of, I will be their God and they will be my people. And this continues to ring through in the Old Testament. It actually refers back to Leviticus 26, verses 11 to 12. And we see it looking forward in Revelation chapter 21, verse 3 in the New Testament. And so as a result, God will restore and repopulate Israel, making her the greatest kingdom in the world. Now, it's important to understand this doesn't apply to like the present day political Israel. This is speaking of God's kingdom where the Messiah is going to come and the people will not be based upon where they live, but do they follow Yahweh? We're going to begin our time, we're going to examine some of these prophets, and there's no way, and again, in light of the time frame, that we can examine all of them. So I'm going to hit, again, some of the big ones and some of the minor ones. So hopefully, again, this will be the start of some further study for you. So we're going to start with the prophet Isaiah. So Isaiah was a prophet during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. In fact, he's the one who intercedes for Hezekiah, and as a result, Hezekiah's life is extended. You might recall the phrase where Isaiah says, "Here I am, send me." And so Isaiah volunteers to be Yahweh's prophet. We see this happen in Isaiah chapter 6. Now, I want to address one issue in regards to Isaiah, and that's the question of authorship. Because if you spend any time in Isaiah, you will have to confront this at some point. Because there's a debate on what do we do with chapters 40 through chapter 66. See, it's important to understand to begin with first that the unity of Isaiah was widely attested until the 18th century. But with, again, source criticism started in the Tübingen School in Germany in the 1800s. People began to wonder, like, well, hold on, is this really what's going on? And they're trying to determine the sources. And so the issue that people deal with is, it seems to be, again, in chapters 40 through 66, that Isaiah is speaking to people who are in exile and then people who are after the exile. And so how is it that Isaiah, who was living before this time, can do such things? So people begin to wonder, did Isaiah travel to the future? You know, or did God give him insight? Or did a later scribe apply his writings to the period? Or is there something else going on? And I think it's important to understand that fundamental assumptions will impact where you land on this issue. Namely, do you believe, or does one believe, that the supernatural can happen? Does God interact in space, time, and history? Because if He does, He can help Isaiah look into the future. He can help Isaiah predict Cyrus. He can help Isaiah comfort these people both in the exile and post-exile. And so whether it is God using that method, or maybe it's again, maybe Isaiah left writings behind and later people put those in. This will be something I encourage you to read about and look after. But I will say strongly that God is at work in space, time, and history, and He's speaking through His prophets. And so with that, Isaiah has more to share. And one of the things he wants to share is that God is going to use the Davidic line to restore God's people. And this is in keeping with the Davidic covenant that we see in 2 Samuel chapter 7, which I mentioned previously. In addition, Isaiah during his time confronts Hezekiah's bragging to Babylon. So Hezekiah had done quite well in his life. He had been faithful to God. He had been faithful to, restore worship of God. But yet at the end of his life, when it gets extended, the Babylonians come and he brags about his wealth to them. And it's during this time that Hezekiah confronts him and through that predicts the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. There's also the mention of two servants in chapters 40 to 48 and 49 to 56 within Isaiah. With this, we learn that God will redeem Israel from Babylon through Cyrus. Again, Cyrus was named. It wasn't, there will be some king. It's like, no, there will be a king and his name is Cyrus. The servant in Isaiah is used in reference to Cyrus, to Israel, to the writer of the book, and to some idealized or paradigmatic figure who's currently residing and as well in the future, as we see in Isaiah 42, 1-9. And sometimes it alludes to more than one person at the same time. For example, Isaiah chapter 52, 13 to 53, 12, speaking of both Isaiah and the Messiah. And so God, again, is letting them see that He will also deal with Israel's sin through the suffering servant that He mentions in this passage. Jesus fulfills the role of the suffering servant. He brings it to its highest and complete expression. And that's what's important to understand. This is another thing we see in prophetic literature. It's the idea of multiple fulfillment, that something can be fulfilled, but the greater fulfillment is coming. And that's when we read these suffering servant passages in Isaiah. It becomes apparent to us with our New Testament goggles as we look back and we see, these are speaking of Christ. Again, the highest and complete expression of God. The next prophet we're going to examine is Jeremiah, who had, frankly, you see the title there, a hard road. So whereas Isaiah volunteered for his position, Jeremiah was in fact coerced or seduced by Yahweh to warn Judah of Babylonian destruction for their unrepentant ways. He talks about this in chapter 20, verse 7 of the book of Jeremiah. And so Jeremiah is going to experience a rough and hard life. He will be persecuted. He will be locked in the stocks. He will be thrown in a cistern. He will be kidnapped later in life. He had it really hard. And despite Jeremiah's efforts, despite all of his hard work, from what we can see in the scripture, no one came to faith. Instead, he has community from his scribe, Baruch, who kept him company, but few others did. And so Jeremiah was persecuted many times over for his message. It was not a welcome message. Others were saying, actually, Jerusalem won't be destroyed, but he was adamant that Jerusalem would be destroyed. He was bringing bad news, and everyone just wanted to hear good news. And so as a result, God allowed him to not only keep speaking that, but he even witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, leading him to write the book of Lamentations. And as you might recall from a previous lecture, he was kidnapped and taken to Egypt with Judean rebels. He told them, don't run to Egypt. Egypt is not going to save you. The Babylonians will still take you out, but they were choosing to defy God and not go into exile. And that's exactly what happened. And this is likely where Jeremiah perished. Another interesting prophet, and part of our major prophets, is Ezekiel, a prophet in exile. And he's an interesting cat, and you're going to see that again as we talk some about him. So Ezekiel was a prophet during the exile, or he was an exilic prophet. And so he was in Babylon. And he was known for his eccentric acts, or basically like street performances. He was taken to Babylon in the first wave of exiles in 597 BC. So this occurs during 2 Kings chapter 24, 10 to 16. And so God, during his time there, God renders him mute. So see, here's some examples. God renders him mute in Ezekiel 3. He builds a model of Jerusalem, and then he destroys it. He laid on his side for 390 days, and then repeated on the other side for 40 days, all the while feeding himself on barley cakes that he cooked over manure. He cuts off his hair and his beard with a sword. And so it's these kind of eccentric acts that he does that we kind of look and we're like, why is he doing this? He was doing this to draw attention, the people to draw attention to him and to listen to the message that he had. And so another thing too about Ezekiel is that over 70 times in the text of Ezekiel, the purpose of Yahweh's actions are stated as, then they will know that I am Yahweh. And it included the nations as well as Judah, because God is wanting to let his people know who he is, as well as others around them. God also predicts rejection due to the hard hearts, but promises to bring about a new heart for Judah. This is one of the key themes you see throughout Ezekiel, is that God is transplanting. He's doing a heart transplant. He's going from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh, a heart that isn't teachable to a heart that is teachable. Ezekiel also confronts Judah's fatalistic attitude in chapter 18. You may remember how I've quoted Ezekiel 18:23 many times. That is a fantastic chapter in the book, because in it, Ezekiel is sitting there and saying, look, the people themselves thought, hey, we're in Babylon through no faults of our own. It doesn't matter what we do, whether we're faithful or not, because, we just got put here. And we're going to stay here and we're stuck here because of decisions that we can't help. And so it was very fatalistic. And what Ezekiel makes clear in that chapter is each person will be held responsible for their actions. So he gives the case example. A father, if you have a man, he follows God, he loves God, he is faithful to God. But just because he is, and his actions will count for himself. In other words, God will love him. He is one of God's. But let's say he has a son who doesn't listen to God, does his own thing, and is completely ignorant of God. Well, the father's righteousness or the father's faith does not count for the son. And so that son has to deal with what he has. But let's say that son has a son, so the grandson of the father. And this one, unlike his father, he decides, like his grandfather, to worship God and to follow him. Will his father's bad, unrighteous behavior affect him? Absolutely not, says Ezekiel. He is responsible for his own actions, and so God will honor him. And so Ezekiel was having to fight the fatalism of the day. He was having to breathe hope into these people. Here's some other things about Ezekiel. Namely, that he stresses the Spirit of God has left the temple. You might read the early chapters of Ezekiel. It's like a wheel and a wheel and a wheel. It's this interesting image. And the idea is that here he is in Babylon, and he has seen that though his people are back in Jerusalem, because remember, he's part of the first wave, he has seen that the Spirit of God has left the temple and that God has judged his people and he's no longer there. And so God will later rebuild a temple and make things new, which he talks about at the end of his book. Also, it's important to realize that God brings about the death of Ezekiel's wife as a parallel to the fall of Jerusalem. It's a painful reminder. See, these prophets had to live some of this stuff out because God wept over the actions of the Israelites. He wept over them like losing a spouse. And so he allowed Ezekiel's wife to die so that as a parallel example to show them of how God felt. Because again, God is essentially divorcing Jerusalem by allowing it to fall because they've already left him behind. And so just as the Jews loved the temple, Ezekiel so did his wife. And so God called both to mourn in silence. And he did so because by mourning in silence, it does not say, it's showing like, look, the actions of these people, the actions of the Israelites were not right. And they were right to be correctly rebuked and be led into exile. Ezekiel also offers bold predictions in the latter half of the book. Here is a nation that is in exile under the strength of Babylon, and yet he promises restoration and a renewal of the people of God. This idea of the valley of dry bones that will become alive and have flesh on them. And then God later says, I will give you a heart, again, a heart of flesh over a heart of stone, pointing back to what will happen to his people in the future. There's also the destruction of evil nations that is symbolized by Gog, the city of Gog in the book of Ezekiel. And the book concludes with the presence of God dwelling in a restored temple. So again, remember that the temple at the beginning, it had departed from Jerusalem. Well, now God's presence will return to Jerusalem with a restored temple, and out of it will come a river, a life-restoring stream that is going to flow out of Jerusalem and down to, and bring life wherever it goes. And it's going to pour into the Dead Sea. And now something that was previously dead will now become a flourishing, beautiful garden, a picture of what God is going to do with his people. So that concludes our major prophets, and so now we're going to move to some of our minor prophets, among those being Hosea. And you see the title there, Committed Love. And Hosea, just as Ezekiel and these others had a tough task, God gives Hosea a very hard task by asking him to marry Gomer so that their marriage may be a testimony to Israel. The reality is, though, Gomer often commits adultery, cheating on Hosea, just as God's people do the same with their idols. And so he becomes a living picture of what Israel is doing to God. Together, they have 3 children through that. And again, there could be some debate as to whether those actually belong to Hosea or one of her lovers. And yet he loves them as his own. Hosea is also called to pay off Gomer's debts to her lovers. And he continues to romantically pursue her by leaving groceries outside of the homes that she's sleeping, of the men she's sleeping with. Think again of how that must feel. And so Hosea is the most graphic prophetic story of Israel's marriage covenant with God. When you read through it, you will see examples of this in the text. And yet, God makes clear through Hosea that he will renew his people and bring a Messiah. He says in chapter 14, verse 4, I will heal their waywardness and love them freely, for my anger will turn away from them. Picturing again, as I mentioned, within each one of these books, that picture of redemption, where God is continually committed to his people. The next minor prophet we're going to speak about is Jonah. Now, again, this is a story you're likely very familiar with. You're like, oh, Jonah and the whale. Well, it's a big fish, okay? Now, again, subsequently we thought, well, maybe it's a whale. Could be, but regardless, the text makes it clear it's a large fish. And Jonah is the story of a disobedient prophet whose lack of concern for the Ninevites, the Assyrians, contrasts with God. See, the reason Jonah didn't even want to go to Assyria is because he's appalled by the evil of the Assyrians. And so he refuses to minister to them and is angry when they repent. He frankly says, I would rather die than see this. To give you an idea of his hatred, it would be as if God asked a Jewish man or Jewish woman during the time of the Holocaust to go to Berlin and to try to lead the Nazis, try to lead these people to him. These are the people that are destroying your families. They're destroying your fellow Jews. Why are you going to do that? And it's that hatred of Jonah that causes him to resist. But again, God has a big fish anywhere and he can move you. And so finally Jonah relents and does. And so when he spreads his message throughout Nineveh, he's hoping they don't. But the king of Nineveh pauses and he says, hold on, who knows? Maybe God will change his mind about the judgment that he's prophesied for our city, and maybe he will relent. And so the Ninevites' repentance results in God relenting from judgment. And as I mentioned, this infuriates Jonah because he wanted to see God's hand upon them. And so what we learn through Jonah's story is that God's concern for the Ninevites extends even to the cattle. Not just the people, but even if you read in chapter 4, verse 11, that God even cares about the cattle. So again, emphasizing that God is committed to these people. And so too, this should make us wonder, if God is at work in Nineveh, if he is sending prophets to Nineveh, where else could he be sending prophets? Who else does he care about? God concludes the book with a question. He says, should I not be concerned about Nineveh? And so the book ends with a question without an answer. And because, again, he's asking Jonah, should I not be concerned? And Jonah doesn't give an answer. Because the narrator or the writer of the book wants to show us that, of course, God is concerned about Nineveh. But it's clear from Jonah's actions that his heart still has work to be done. That in fact, it is now him, not the Ninevites, that needs to do some self-examination. Another minor prophet would be Nahum. Now, Nahum is interesting because he talks about that God will not allow violent empires to endure. You can see where this would be encouraging for the people pre-exile. Because the Assyrians, and remember, just as Jonah went to the Assyrians, Nahum is speaking about the Assyrians to the Israelites, to the nation of Israel. And he makes it clear, he says, God will not allow violent empires to endure. The Assyrians are an example of this. And this would later be remembered for the Romans. This would be a text that the later Jews would take comfort on because they would realize, okay, just as God will deal with the Assyrians, God will deal with these Romans. And so the judgment on evil is welcomed by the oppressed. And so it's a reminder that God is going to handle these situations. In addition, Yahweh is grieved by the death of the innocent, and so he acts in judgment. In chapter 3, verse 1, Nahum gives a warning to the city built on innocent blood. He reminds that anyone who hears this, that Yahweh will avenge those who they afflict, that the nations too will rejoice at the destruction of these evil nations, and that, referencing chapter 1, verse 7, God will care for those who take refuge in him. And so again, you're seeing with these prophets, their role was not only to push Israel back to this covenant faithfulness, but it was also to remind them of God's faithfulness to them. And that even in the midst of all the violence they're seeing around them, that he would be faithful to take care of them. We're also going to speak real quick about Daniel. Now, I know we referenced him back in our lecture regarding the exile, because that's when Daniel lived. But this time we'll speak a little bit about Daniel's visions. I'm not promising at all to tell you what Daniel's visions mean. There's a lot, I know the limits of my understanding, but we'll at least go through some of the stuff. So in chapter 7, it speaks of a horrible beast with a great horn. And it's during this that the Son of Man appears and slays this beast before taking his seat next to the Ancient of Days. Again, Son of Man is a term that Jesus will use often for himself. And then too, the Ancients of Days, kind of again from our Trinitarian theology, points toward God the Father. So again, as to who this would point to, it's saying, look, there is going to be a time of judgment. God will handle things. There's also the vision of a ram and a goat in chapter 8. The ram represents the Medo-Persians. The goat represents the Greeks, with the large horn being Alexander the Great. But if you might recall, Alexander the Great died and was replaced by 4 generals. And those are the 4 horns that replace it, because those represent those 4 generals. And then the final horn, even amidst that, there is a final horn that will elevate himself above God. And this could represent Antiochus Epiphanes or Antiochus IV. Remember, because he wanted to make himself God. He went through the temple and ripped stuff out because he wanted the people to worship him. It could also point to the one day idea of the Antichrist, who will try to make himself as God. And this is the thing as well with prophetic literature, is that there can be multiple fulfillment. In other words, partial fulfillment, waiting for the final fulfillment. Now let's take a further look at some others of Daniel's visions. For example, in chapter 9, The angel says that the exile will continue 7 times longer than Jeremiah prophesied due to Israel's continued sin. You're like, I may not be no math major, but that's 490 years. Well, I don't get it. Like, they're in exile. They were gone after 70. And so, as you can imagine, there's a great amount of discussion as to what this 490 years means. I'd encourage you to go do a little bit of research yourself and maybe see where you're going to land on that. Chapters 10 to 11 offer a similar vision to the earlier one which I mentioned about Antiochus IV, that ends with the dreaded king of the north. Many people do believe this to be Antiochus Epiphanes, and it could be. But as I've mentioned before, multiple fulfillment is also an option with prophetic literature. So while it could refer to others besides Antiochus, it could also refer to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in AD 70. And so this is one of the things about prophetic literature. We can recognize that there can be fulfillments, but then the final fulfillment will happen at one time. In the end, though, Daniel shows there will be wicked oppressors in the future. If you get one part from this, understand this: there will be wicked oppressors in the future, but God will overcome them and take care of His people. And that was a message of comfort to people who were in exile and people after the exile. Now we have Habakkuk. And Habakkuk, I have on there a bone to pick, because basically Habakkuk is going to have a debate with God. That's exactly what he does. And so he wonders how he can believe in Yahweh with all the tragedy in the world as he looks around. He basically looks and he says, what are you doing with all this stuff? And what are you going to do about Judah's corruption? Because I'm looking at Judah and it's horrible. And God states, again, because this is before the exile, God states that Babylon will handle it through judgment. In other words, yep, I am well aware of what Judah's done, and I'm going to handle it through Babylon. But Habakkuk doesn't like this response. He says, whoa, 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 whoa. This nation is even worse than Judah. So how can you use a worse nation to punish Judah? And he debates God about this. And so God makes it clear that He will judge Babylon as well, and others like them. And God tells Habakkuk that He can use corrupt nations and does use them, though He doesn't endorse them. Just because He allows them to do this doesn't mean it is an endorsement, doesn't mean it is His approval. And so we see within the book of Habakkuk that, quote, the righteous will live by faith. So we see within it a call to trust Yahweh, a call to trust the things we don't understand and to recognize the limits of our own knowledge. And as they banter back and forth, Habakkuk reaches a conclusion that despite the hard times, despite the things that he can't quite grasp, quote, I will rejoice in the Lord. It's a fantastic passage where essentially he says, even if there is no fruit on the vine, no cattle in the stalls, no wheat in the fields, this is pretty bleak, all right? Still, I will put my faith in the Lord because He gives me the agility of the deer. Well, the agility of the deer in the mountains to climb over all kinds of obstacles. So even God, if things look horrible, I can still put my faith in You, and I know You're at work and You will help me overcome these things. And so Habakkuk's story is one of great and growing faith in the goodness and sovereignty of God in bringing about His desired conclusions, even if we don't understand or agree. And this is the humbled and surrendered posture that we see in chapter 2, verse 1. In conclusion, for our lecture here on the prophetical literature, we will deal with Malachi, the last prophet, or again, let's do another bad seminary joke, the Italian prophet Malachi. Ha ha, woo! Here all week. And Malachi's job was to honor Yahweh. That was one of the drum beats that he hit. And why did he do that? He is a prophet after the exile. The Jews are back in Jerusalem, so they are back in their land. And God has given them back the place that was once there. But the problem is they were not giving God their best sacrifices. Because as they looked around, they were still suffering. They were still dealing with stuff, and they thought, well, hey, we thought when we'd return, it would look better than this. And so life did not look as they thought it should. It did not fit in the box that they had put. And so they held back their best as a means of self-protection. In other words, God, if you're not going to take care of me, I guess I got to take care of myself. So you can have my cancerous goat. Here's my three-legged lamb. So again, I'm going to keep the best for my stuff because it's clear you're not taking care of me. And this is evident too that there was famine in the land, as we see in chapter 3, verse 11. So the people were dealing with adversity. Yet this adversity was to push them closer to Him, because God makes it clear, if you would bring the entire tithe into the storehouse, bring it all in. Give me your best goat, as I call you to. Give me your best lamb. Give me your first fruits of your crops. Test me in this matter, and then see if I bless you. Risk. Take and risk. And so God promises to provide over and above what they need. And so this can still be very relevant to us today, where we look around and we're like, well, I just don't know. I'm uncertain about the future. And God says, no, 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 no. Don't hold back. Give me the best of your time. Give me the best of your energy. Give me the best of your money, of whatever it might be. Give it to me so that then you can see me show up and I can become real to you. And this is something, again, when this happens, we experience God on a level that we wouldn't otherwise. And that's what Malachi was asking these people to do. In addition, besides that, Malachi predicts that a forerunner and that Elijah will come. In other words, there's going to be someone coming. So he's like, just wait, just wait. There's a forerunner coming, and there's great things coming with him. And this forerunner will be John the Baptist. And the new Elijah will become Jesus, who gives the people a new heart. And so it's with this that essentially God turns off the radio and says, be faithful. I'm not going to reveal anymore. I've revealed all these things to you. Remind yourself of those. Be faithful until this forerunner and the new Elijah show up. So in many respects, that the intertestamental period, that period of silence from God, we in our current reality are in a similar deal, where God has said, I have revealed the truth to you. I have told you these things. Dwell on these truths. And so the difference is, whereas they were waiting for this Messiah, this new Elijah to come, you and I are waiting on the new Elijah to return. But in the meantime, we're called to be faithful. And so the creed, the things we see, the promotions from Malachi, the promptings, we need to listen to those and heed those. Some final themes. The reality of the hard heart of the people of God. No matter who God uses, His people were determined to continue in idolatry and other sins. You have probably seen that throughout this entire series as we've gone through it. You might recall again from our first lecture, Genesis 8:21, that the human heart is wicked from birth. Yet despite this, God continually pursues His people, seeking a teachable heart. Again, going back to Ezekiel, to put in a new heart, a heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone. And even if He has to, He will, just like in Genesis 50, verse 20, that God will work despite the evil of humanity, and He does constantly. What you intended for evil, God will use for good. We also see that redemption is coming in the form of an anointed one or a Messiah who will lead God's people in the way He calls them to live. And so Israel, as a result, was always looking for and encouraging Messiahs. Come on, we want out of this. And you see, as we went through these intertestamental lectures, all the different oppressors, and subsequently into the New Testament era, with whether it's the Romans or others. And so there's this looking for a new Messiah that's in the form of a historic Davidic conquering reign. But God is going to provide the ultimate Messiah in the Son of David. And He's going to look different than what they expected. And of course, that is something we will go more in detail with in New Testament background. But until then, we have one more session remaining where we look over the wisdom literature, and I look forward to having you and seeing you during that time.